I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and God will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." This was the vision of a man we know only as John of Patmos, a Greek mystic who lived on the island of Patmos and wrote a book that has come down to us as the book of Revelation. It's the one in the Bible that has all that stuff about the mark of the beast, 666, that you remember from the Omen movies. And you went and you looked it up. Oh my God, it's really in the Bible! Elaine Pagels wrote a wonderful book recently explaining how the book of Revelation can and should be read as a metaphor for the Roman Empire and not literally as a prediction of the actual judgment day. But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about this morning. That will wait for another time because that's really interesting stuff too. What I wanted to point out to you this morning in this vision of John's, did you notice? His vision locates the new world that God will create, the kingdom come, if you will, in a city, a holy city, come down from heaven dressed as a bride for her husband, which, if you have seen that show, Say Yes to the Dress, you know is obviously a reference to great beauty, majesty, splendor, belovedness. This is no casual bride in bare feet and a little cotton sundress. This is the big deal, you know, the veil and the poof and all of that stuff. There may be some cities that when you think of them evoke splendor and beauty and belovedness. But cities in general, do they do that for you? Hartford, Connecticut, for instance. Akron, Ohio. I got a good groan from over there. That's good. Or Lynn, Massachusetts. The word urban in our time, have you noticed, is used as a synonym for crime, poverty, pollution, blight. When reporters talk about urban youth, we see in our mind's eye, as we are meant to, usually African-American kids in hoodies, hanging around on the corner up to no good. Right? And the imagining stops there because we're pretty sure we know where that story goes. Sad lives, bad education, parental neglect or abandonment, little cause for hope. There's a lot of cultural conditioning that goes along with this. We're being messaged this way all the time, no matter where we live. If we live in the city or if we live in the rural areas or in the suburbs. My messaging along those lines began when I was a little girl, and I want to tell you about it. If I've already told you about it, please forgive me, because it really belongs also in this sermon. When I was a little kid, my parents moved us from the city of Norwalk, Connecticut, where my dad had grown up, to New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a much more affluent and much more suburban community, also in Fairfield County. They moved us for the schools, so my dad said, but I know there was a good deal of social striving in his choice. My siblings and I did benefit from the amazing education we got in the New Canaan public schools, but my parents had a much more critical engagement with the wealth in our town. They absolutely supported the education. They cast a much more critical eye on the sort of social context we were growing up in, and they constantly said to my siblings and me, "This is not the real world. Remember that." Sometimes, especially around the holidays when they wanted to drop off anonymous gifts or donations, or when they simply wanted to generate a conversation with us about privilege and economic inequality, or maybe they just wanted to remind us not to take for granted what we had, my mom or dad, or sometimes both, would get us into the station wagon and drive us to South Norwalk, which is the really bad part of Norwalk, and drive slowly through the streets to show us how folks lived. We would crawl along in the car with the doors locked, of course, touring the broken down streets and sometimes jumping out of the car to rush and put a box of groceries on a porch or slip an envelope with some cash in it into a mailbox that looked especially derelict. I want to tell you that I so appreciate what Carl and Shirley were trying to do with that. I do not judge them for the manner in which they did it. But now, I cringe, thinking of how it instilled in me, these little trips, instilled in me a sense that the urban environment of the poor was nothing but danger and waste and need, and a place that you would drive into, throw money at, and get the hell out of. Skidding around the corner, you know. Later, when I taught high school in a poor, predominantly African American and Latino population school in a gang-infested part of Chicago, I roared with laughter when my students would imitate people like me doing what they called the white lady purse grab and the exaggerated, panicky, lost white people driving car door lock. This was before our automatic locks on, everybody's car doors. My students were my teachers of racism and fear and othering. They, imagining the emotionally sterile environment of the affluent suburbs, shook their heads with pity at the way my peers and I grew up. It was such a gift to see their world through their eyes, gritty and tough, but life, beloved life, full of hope, a lot of joy, a lot of celebration, a lot of juiciness, full of beauty my eyes had never been trained to see. Driving to school for a day of teaching, I began to see the streets with a different eye. I lived in a leafy, nicer part of town with landscaped apartment buildings and a funky little coffee shops and an independent movie theater. As I drove over to Maywood, though, the green became less and less, and the trash in the streets more. But when I passed the groups of black teenage boys huddled in hoodies and starter jackets, wearing the gym shoes for which any of them could be jumped at gunpoint, instead of bumping on my locks, I would unroll the window to call out a greeting and to receive theirs. Hey, Ms. V! Better lock your door, Ms. V! I began to notice the beauty of the urban landscape. A window box of red geraniums that a woman with 3 jobs still took the time to put up in her apartment window. A grotto for Our Lady in the front yard, nestled to a chain link fence in what we call here in Boston the Virgin Mary on the half shell. Colorful graffiti brightening up abandoned spaces. Cars with bright metallic paint, booming hip-hop as they drove down the streets. Groups of kids standing around harmonizing, rapping, breakdancing. Now, if I polled this congregation right here and said, where do you experience your closest spiritual connection to the holy? How many of you would say, in nature? Right? Right? I mean, you don't have to raise your hands, but that's absolutely nothing. I mean, that's our tradition. That's our heritage. It comes from the 19th century New England Transcendentalist movement, which was so much an influence on the Unitarians and the Universalists, with a romantic, capital R romantic sense of nature and the sense of God as being immanent in nature. So we have Emerson and especially Henry David Thoreau to thank for that tradition. This was a reaction particularly against industrialization. So not only have we inherited a very romantic 19th century appreciation for nature, We also nowadays have a very legitimate and serious concern about the survival of the nature we love and cherish so much. And we regard the natural world as more precious than ever because we have this fear and anxiety that it's going away. And that's a real truth that we're holding. A few weeks ago, the Green Sanctuary Ministry team asked us all to make a commitment to get out in nature, to connect with it intentionally, and take a friend with you. And I know that yesterday, Tony says that 23 people went on the tour of the Lynn Woods, which is the hike of the Lynn Woods, which is so fantastic. And I myself did a little nature connecting yesterday. I went on a beach walk at Phillips Beach in Swampscott or Marblehead with a friend. It was wonderful. It was healing, refreshing. And it was very easy to find the goddess in the wind and the tides and the sky. I talked with my friend Lily about today's service as we walked and how the city has become, by comparison with nature, the city has become a place that represents fallenness. The city has become, in much of our popular imagination, a problem to be solved, not a place to be cherished, not a place where you're going to find God, but a place that is just desperate and needy and scary. I'm still unpacking how much this attitude influences my own thinking and attitude toward the city as an idea, a metaphor, and as an actual place. I realize now that most of my relationship with cities has been that of a consumer. Let me explain what I mean. This means that I've always gotten on a train or in the car, gone into the city. This started when I was a little girl, when I would visit Dad at work in New York City. He worked in Manhattan. And I would go see a show, shop, go to a fun restaurant, avoid the bad parts, avoid the bad people, keep my purse clutched close to my body, and then get out of the city home safe and sound to New Canaan. And this continued in my young adulthood, but I took a course in college called Human Geography. And our professor made us get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and meet at the L station in Chicago and get on the L and go to like the worst part of Chicago and walk around and watch the city wake up. And it was so scary because we just thought, we're going to get killed. We're going to get killed. And I was like staying close to the group and in fact, what we saw was the industry and the life of Chicago as the sun began to rise, and you just saw this amazing kind of symphony starting up. And it was a stunning thing. I realized that cities are beautiful organisms, and for the first time in my life, I was given a sense of reverence for cities. And it made me want to explore forever after that the untouristed streets of cities, which I have done in many, many cities since then, including all of the cities I have lived near or in. Exactly 1 year ago, I met you all, a suburban congregation with an urban mission and ministry. And I began looking around for housing. I was drawn initially to Salem because Salem's so cool. And I explored Marblehead and looked around Swampscott. But I quickly realized, I heard that little still small voice within, I realized that I had finally had a wonderful opportunity in my life, not only to be in ministerial relationship with the nearest city or a consumer relationship with my nearest city, doing cultural things and getting out of town, or doing community service and social justice work and getting out of town, but that I could and should be a neighbor, finally, in a city, to make it my city. When Henry David Thoreau moved to the little tiny cabin in Walden Woods in Walden Pond, he wrote famously, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately." I hope you won't be offended if I appropriate Thoreau this morning and say, I went to the city because I wished to live deliberately. Just as Henry Thoreau wanted to chronicle the life of the pond and to see the hand of God in it, so did I and so do I wish to chronicle the life of the city from up close and learn not only to be involved with it, thinking of it as a place in need, but I want to see God in the city and learn to see the way God sees the city. James Hillman is a Jungian psychoanalyst. He says that God-given and man-made are an unnecessary and even false opposition. So interesting. And he says why? The city made by human hands is natural in its own right, which I love. Never thought of that. He writes, surely it is as natural for human beings to make burial grounds, marketplaces, political and social communities, and to erect structures for worship, education, protection, and celebration, as it is for them to gather nuts and berries, trap animals, or hoe the soil. Cities belong to human nature. Nature does not begin outside the city walls. Therefore, the city does not have to copy the green world in order to be beautiful. The city does not have to copy the green world in order to be beautiful. The vision of John of Patmos, the new city on a hill, may never come to pass, where there will be a new heaven and a new earth with the holy city coming down from heaven adorned as a bride. But for now, I invite you to join me in opening yourselves even wider than you already are to the beauties of the city, and particularly to the beauty of the cities on either side of this church. I encourage you to make them your own beautiful cities, not just as places to visit that need your help and service, but as places that offer themselves to you as the enchanted and the enchanting places that they are. Thank you. Amen.